Marie Antoinette wasn't treated with dignity. She was dragged out as a symbol of everything the Revolution wanted to destroy. Her hair was crudely chopped off, not for hygiene, but to make the guillotine blade's job easier. Her hands were tied so tightly they left bruises. She wasn't granted a royal farewell. She was paraded through the streets like an animal headed to slaughter. It was a story of grace to grass. The crowds howled and some threw garbage. Others shouted slurs. She wore a plain white chemise, no jewels, no corset, no majesty. The very outfit was an insult, meant to erase her past and reduce her to just another criminal. But what if I tell you everything they accused Marie Antoinette was a lie? Forget the image of the stoic queen calmly facing death beneath a flawless white wig. That version was made to soften the truth, to make a claim for her execution. They said she deserved it, but never told you what really happened behind the prison walls. In reality, what went behind was nothing short of mental torture followed by humiliation. Once you know the truth, you'll never see history or mercy the same way again. By the time she stood before the guillotine, Marie Antoinette wasn't a queen. She was a widow, a prisoner, a mother torn from her children, a woman who had lost everything and was about to lose her head. This wasn't justice. It was revenge, wrapped in the illusion of righteousness. After the fall of the monarchy, Marie Antoinette was transferred to the conciergerie, known by revolutionaries as death's antechamber. Her cell was damp, windowless, and infested. Straw covered the floor. A wooden cot served as her bed. Sewage seeped through the walls. The woman who once dined with silver spoons now lived among rats. They took everything. Her clothes were replaced with rough peasant garments. Her hair, once powdered and styled by servants, hung in tangled strands. Even her name was erased. She was no longer Her Majesty. She was simply Prisoner 280, a number scrawled on a piece of parchment and nailed to her cell. Surveillance was constant. Guards watched her even as she slept. Every move, every breath was monitored. When she wept, they mocked her. When she prayed, they interrupted. Privacy did not exist. Silence was a luxury she was denied. She wasn't waiting for trial. She was being broken. Her youngest child had been torn from her arms. Her husband was already dead. Her closest allies were gone. The Queen of France had been reduced to a spectacle, held up as proof that even the highest could fall. But what the crowds never saw was the slow erosion that happened in that cell. The real execution began long before the blade fell. It started with isolation, with decay, with the systematic erasure of everything that once made her human. She wasn't just awaiting death. She was broken daily, interrogated, insulted, deprived of sleep, denied basic hygiene. Guards whispered vile rumors. Spies were planted in her cell. Her once silken hands bled from frost and filth. They didn't need blades or chains to torture Marie Antoinette. They used time, silence, and humiliation. Slowly, deliberately. She was kept under constant surveillance, not for her safety, but to exhaust her mind. Lanterns burned through the night. Guards took turns watching her every movement, preventing rest, waiting for her to crack. There was no moment of peace, not even to grieve. Every few days she was dragged from her cell and interrogated. The questions weren't to seek truth. They were designed to humiliate. Revolutionary officials hurled accusations with no proof, spying, corruption, even incest. Her denials meant nothing. The verdict had already been written. These sessions were not about justice. They were about degradation. Inside her cell, things were worse. Informants posed as fellow prisoners. They reported everything: her words, her cries, her silence. Even her breathing was a matter of state. The food was barely edible. Her drinking water came in dirty containers. Lice spread through her clothes. Her gums bled. Her skin cracked from the cold. Her hands, once manicured and perfumed, now shook with fever and frostbite. The worst cruelty wasn't physical. It was what they made her believe, that she was forgotten, hated, abandoned. Her children were taken. Her letters were intercepted. Her memories were used against her. By the time the trial approached, Marie Antoinette was no longer a queen in the eyes of the world or herself. She had been slowly starved of dignity, sanity, and hope. What she endured wasn't imprisonment. It was a slow, calculated unraveling of a human soul. Marie Antoinette was hauled before the Revolutionary Tribunal on October 14, 1793. Pale, thin, and visibly ill, she faced a courtroom packed with hostile spectators and judges who had no intention of hearing her side. Their minds were made up, their thirst for blood insatiable. The charges were absurd: conspiring with foreign enemies, draining France's treasury, corrupting her son. Each accusation is more grotesque than the last. The most vile? Incest with her own child, a claim so outrageous it stunned even the crowd into momentary silence. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. Her response was quiet, direct. Nature refuses to answer such a charge made to a mother. It was the only moment she was allowed her dignity. Her lawyers were powerless. Interruptions came constantly. Evidence was fabricated or misrepresented. Witnesses were unreliable, often drunk, sometimes bribed. Any attempt at defense was dismissed as disrespectful to the revolution. The public wasn't there for justice. They wanted a show. And she gave them none. No tears, no panic, just a calm that infuriated them more than any defiance could. After 2 days of charade, the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. Not because she was proven guilty, but because she was hated. She left the courtroom not as a condemned woman, but as a corpse in waiting. Her death had been decided before the trial began. Everything in between was just theater, a final humiliation dressed up as law. Justice wasn't blind. It had been gagged and dragged to the guillotine alongside her. On the morning of October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was led from her cell in silence. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back. Her hair, roughly cut for the blade, exposed her face to the cold. She wore a plain white shift, soaked at the hem from the damp prison floor. No cloak, no shoes fit for travel, no dignity. Then came the final insult: the cart. Unlike her husband, who was allowed the privacy of a carriage, she was placed in an open wooden cart reserved for criminals and thieves. There was no roof to shield her from the elements or the crowd. She stood exposed, half-starved, discolored from sickness, barely able to keep her balance. As the cart rolled through the streets, thousands lined the route. They didn't come to mourn, they came to mock. They shouted insults, screamed vulgarities, pelted her with rotten food. Some laughed, others cursed, a few danced. Mothers lifted their children onto their shoulders to point at the dying queen, teaching them what the fall of privilege looked like. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She stared ahead, silent, motionless, not out of pride, but sheer exhaustion. The ride took nearly an hour. Every jolt of the wheel was a reminder of how far she had fallen, from Versailles to this. When the cart finally stopped, the scaffold waited, stained from earlier deaths. She didn't walk toward it as a queen. She staggered forward as the final offering to a revolution that no longer needed justice, only blood. Every part of Marie Antoinette's appearance on the day of her execution was deliberate, not by her, but by those who wanted to erase her completely. Her final outfit wasn't hers to choose. Gone were the silks, the jewels, the corsets laced by servants. Instead, she was given a coarse white chemise, stiff, thin, and meant to humiliate. White, not for purity, but to mark her as a corpse before she was even dead. Her hair, once a symbol of opulence and style, had been hacked away with shears, not styled, not cleaned, just chopped to expose her neck to the guillotine. No wig, no powder, no trace of vanity. Her bare scalp was a final mockery of the woman they once accused of loving luxury too much. Her hands were bound behind her back so tightly the ropes cut into her skin, turning her fingers dark. She couldn't lift her arms. She couldn't steady herself. She couldn't even brush the hair from her face as the wind whipped through the open cart. Her shoes were thin, barely protective. By the time she stepped onto the scaffold, her feet were cold, damp, and blood-smeared from the boards beneath her. The platform was stained from earlier executions. She was not the first. She would not be the last. What she wore wasn't just clothing, it was a statement. This woman is no longer royal, no longer sacred, no longer human. They didn't just want her dead, they wanted her erased, and they used every thread of fabric, every cut of hair, every knot of rope to make that message clear before the blade ever fell. The screams began before she reached the platform. Thousands had gathered at the Place de la Révolution, not to witness justice, but to feast on vengeance. The mob surged against the barriers, shouting, spitting, pushing for a better view. Some laughed, others waved red caps and shouted slurs. The woman they once called Madame Deficit was now just a symbol of everything they blamed for their suffering. Marie Antoinette stepped from the cart with difficulty. Her limbs were stiff from cold and restraint. Her hair clung to her face. Her body, frail and starved, shook under the thin fabric. She struggled to climb the steps, the rope around her hands cutting deeper with each movement. In that moment, amid the chaos, the filth, the screaming, she did something no one expected. She turned to the executioner and said, "Pardon me, sir." "I did not do it on purpose," after stepping on his foot. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't political. It was instinct, reflexive civility in the face of brutality. The crowd didn't care. They shouted louder. Some swore they saw fear in her eyes. Others said she held their gaze like a statue, unmoving, unyielding. There were no final words, no speech, no plea. Just a single woman, bound and broken, standing before a nation that demanded her blood. And above it all, the sound of screaming, cheers, chants, curses echoed across the square as she was strapped to the plank. Her world had already ended. The blade was only the final punctuation. At 12:15 p.m., the blade came down. It was fast, mechanical, merciless. One moment she stood, breathing. The next, her head lay in a basket. Her body convulsed once, then went still. But the horror didn't stop there. The executioner reached into the basket, grabbed her by the hair, and held her head high for the crowd to see. The square erupted, not in silence or sorrow, but in wild, frenzied applause. It wasn't grief. It was a celebration. Spectators cheered as if they'd won a war. Some whistled, others danced. Mothers lifted their children to see the fallen queen's face, now pale, bloodied, and lifeless. There was no moment of reverence, no reflection, just noise, raw, unfiltered joy at the sight of death. Blood streamed down the scaffold, soaking the wood and pooling at the base. Some in the crowd stepped forward, dipping cloth, scarves, even hats into it. They wanted pieces of her, relics from the death of a monarch, a souvenir from the end of a dynasty. The body was thrown into a crude coffin and carted off without ceremony. No priest, no procession, no name carved into the grave. She was buried in a mass pit with other enemies of the revolution, lime poured over her to hasten decay. What remained wasn't a queen, but a spectacle. Her death was meant to be a warning, but it became something uglier, a public obsession. Proof that the revolution had devoured its most famous victim, not in silence, but in a carnival of violence. The blade had fallen, but the madness carried on. Marie Antoinette's execution was supposed to mark a turning point, an end to tyranny, a fresh start for France. Instead, it opened the floodgates to chaos. Her blood hadn't even dried on the scaffold before the revolution began devouring its own. The people rejoiced, but what followed was not freedom. It was fear. The reign of terror accelerated. Neighbors accused neighbors. Trials were rushed. Verdicts were predetermined. The same crowds that had cheered her death now watched new victims fall daily. Priests, journalists, former revolutionaries. No one was safe. Robespierre, one of her loudest accusers, would later follow her to the same guillotine. So would Danton, Desmoulins, Hébert, the architects of the terror, turned into its prey. Power changed hands like a game of Russian roulette. The blade kept falling. Marie Antoinette became more than a queen. She became a symbol of the revolution's hunger, how it started with a promise of justice and ended in mass executions. Her death did not restore balance. It shattered it. And in the years that followed, something strange happened. The woman once mocked and hated began to be remembered differently. Some viewed her as a martyr, others as a cautionary tale. But one truth was undeniable. Her death marked the beginning of a spiral that no one could stop. They wanted to silence her. Instead, they turned her into a ghost that haunted every drop of blood spilled after her own. History painted her with one brush: heartless. A spoiled aristocrat who feasted while France starved, a foreigner who laughed behind silk curtains as the country crumbled. But what they didn't teach you, what they deliberately left out, was the human beneath the crown. The real Marie Antoinette didn't die in Versailles. She died in that filthy cell, piece by piece, stripped of everything but her resolve. She had no throne, no allies, no voice left. Still, she wrote. Her final letter, penned by candlelight the night before her execution, wasn't to defend herself. It was to her children, a mother's last attempt to say goodbye, to explain the unexplainable, to send love through the walls of history. She begged forgiveness, not from France, but from those she loved and had lost. She asked God to protect her son. She showed grace to the very people who tormented her. No revenge, no hatred, just quiet endurance. They didn't teach you about that letter, or how she refused to cry in front of the mob, or how, despite being starved, sick, and shattered, she still carried herself with a dignity her enemies couldn't crush. Her execution wasn't a triumph of the people. It was a warning of what happens when mercy is seen as weakness, when hatred is fed until it demands more than justice. It demands blood. Marie Antoinette didn't die because she was evil. She died because her death was useful. And for centuries that truth was buried, along with her body, her words, and her humanity.